A single generation saw their world turn to dust. Across the ancient world, from Greece to Egypt, the great palace economies fell. They fell together in a synchronized failure. That's the mystery, the late Bronze Age collapse. By the end, you'll see the combination of forces that can shatter an interconnected world. It's a lesson in clay and ash. And in the structure of our own lives, how could climate shifts do it? How could severed trade routes topple empires in a lifetime? And who were those invaders? The mysterious ones in this domino effect. We're going to trace the threads, the fragile threads that held a glittering age together, and see how fast they came apart. What does the fall of a civilization look like from the inside? The palace wasn't a building. It was more like a heart. Everything went to it, and everything came from it. That was the palace economy. A farmer would bring his grain, his olives, to the palace gates. Scribes would write it all down on tablets, every basket. That surplus went into storerooms, big ones, guarded, and then the palace decided. It decided who got what. Artisans got rations, grain, oil, so they could make things. Pottery, jewelry, textiles. Soldiers got fed, got equipped, officials got paid. The whole society was fed from that one central pump. It was efficient. It was controlled. It allowed for specialization. You had full-time weavers, chariot makers, perfume brewers, all because the palace made sure they had food. This system built the walls of Mycenae. It filled the archives of Hattusa. It made the beautiful goods kings gave each other as gifts, and it controlled bronze. Bronze was the key, weapons, tools, status, but bronze needed copper and tin, and they weren't found together. The palace organized the trade missions to get them. Long, dangerous trips, and it controlled the workshops that turned those metals into power. So the king wasn't just a ruler, he was like the CEO, the only corporation. His scribes were the accountants, his granaries were the bank, the redistributed goods were the currency. It created stability for centuries. Everyone knew their place, their ration, their role, but that stability had a cost. Think of a chandelier, a big, complex one, every crystal hanging from one central point. It's beautiful. But if you cut that one chain, the whole thing falls. The palace economy was that chandelier. All the wealth, the food, the decisions concentrated in one place. With a small elite, the farmer didn't trade with the soldier, the smith didn't sell to the official. Everyone depended on the palace's ledger. That made it rigid. If the harvest failed, there was no backup. If a trade route was cut, no alternative. The whole society was built for a predictable world. It had no flexibility. No plan B. That central control was its genius, and it was its fatal flaw. It built an age of gold on foundations of brittle clay. That chandelier wasn't alone. There were many of them, all hanging in that same hall. And you can think of the Eastern Mediterranean that way, not as separate countries on a map, but as one connected system. A world system. On the western edge, you had the Mycenaeans, their fortress cities, places like Mycenae, Pylos, kings ruling from there. Across the Aegean in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire. Their capital was Hattusa, huge stone gates, secret archives. Then south along the coast, the Levant, a corridor of wealthy city-states. Ugarit was one. A cosmopolitan port, languages everywhere in the markets. Further south, Egypt, New Kingdom Egypt, immense wealth, grain, the pharaoh seen as almost divine. And to the east, Mesopotamia, the Kassite kings ruling Babylon. These weren't isolated, they were linked deeply. They spoke to each other. In letters on clay tablets, they called each other brother. And they traded constantly. A merchant ship from Cyprus loaded with copper ingots bound for Greece or Anatolia. That copper would meet tin, a tin that came from far away, from places like modern Afghanistan. They'd alloy it into bronze, ivory from African elephants, rare glass from Mesopotamia, fine oils, perfumes, purple cloth, all of it moving along set routes. By ship, by donkey caravan, that trade created a shared culture for the elites. A Mycenaean warlord might drink from a Cypriot cup. A Hittite prince might wear a gold seal made in an Egyptian style. This network was their source of prosperity. It allowed specialization. Cyprus could focus on copper, Egypt on grain, the Levant on craftsmanship and trade. But this web had a hidden property, interdependence. The system only worked if every part worked. The palace in Greece needed that Cypriot copper. The Hittites relied on grain shipments from their south. Ugarit's entire wealth was from being the middleman. They were all plugged into the same circuit, so a crisis was never just local. A drought in Anatolia didn't just mean hunger for the Hittites. It meant they had less grain to send to allies to pay their troops. Those troops might desert, become raiders. Those raiders could disrupt the trade routes through the Levant. With trade disrupted, the copper from Cyprus couldn't reach Greece, so the Mycenaean palaces couldn't make new weapons or tools, and without those tools, their own economy would stutter. A shock in one area didn't stay contained. It traveled, it amplified, it became a wave. These kingdoms were bound together in a dance of mutual benefit, but also shared risk. They had built a common house, and when the foundations began to tremble in one room, every wall in the house began to shake. The house didn't just fall down all at once. It was more of a groan, then splintering. It gave way piece by piece, and that took about 100 years, roughly from 1200 to 1100 before the Common Era. It was a century of crisis, and it wasn't a series of separate events. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of failures moving across the whole map. Around 1180, the great port of Ugarit sends its last desperate letters. And then it goes silent. The layers of ash there tell a story of violent destruction. Not long after that, the Hittite capital, Hattusa, is abandoned. But this wasn't a retreat. The city was burned. The imperial archives, thousands of clay tablets with treaties, grain shipments, they were baked in those fires and left in the ruins. In Egypt, the new kingdom is reeling. Pharaoh Ramesses III fights these monumental battles. He claims to have repelled waves of invaders from the land and the sea. But his victory is Pyrrhic. Egypt survives, but it shrinks. Its wealth, its influence, it's dramatically reduced. It never regains that former imperial reach. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean world goes dark. Palaces like Pylos, the mighty citadel of Mycenae itself, burned and abandoned. The complex bureaucracy just vanishes. Their writing system, Linear B, is forgotten, and through all this, the records mention a chaotic force. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. They appear in reliefs on temple walls, shown in fierce battles, naval and land. A confederation of different groups with unfamiliar names and headgear. They weren't a single nation. They were more a symptom of the age's immense upheaval. By 1050, the transformation is complete. The age of the grand palaces, of international diplomacy between great kings, of vast bronze shipments and cuneiform letters. That's over. What's left are smaller, poorer, simpler communities. The complex superstructure of society has been stripped away. This tight timeline, this synchronization of collapse, from Greece to the Levant to Anatolia, that's what makes it so compelling. And so puzzling. It feels coordinated. It begs the question, what single force or combination of forces could orchestrate such a widespread, simultaneous failure across so many different kingdoms and cultures? The answer isn't one villain. It's a perfect storm of pressures that began to squeeze this interconnected world from all sides. The first pressure came from the sky changing. We can listen to the past now through science, and what it tells us is clear. Looking at tree rings from old wood and sediment from lake beds in Anatolia and the Levant. The story is one of a major climate shift, a long stretch of severe drought and instability, starting right when the palaces began to weaken. For them, this wasn't just bad weather. It was a threat to their existence. Their whole power structure was built on grain. The palace economy was a giant agricultural machine. It needed predictable, big harvests. To fill the central granaries, that surplus was the fuel. It fed the crowded cities, it paid the soldiers, it supported the scribes and the artisans. When the rains failed, the machine ceased. Crop failures meant empty stomachs. Famine would have spread through the countryside and into the cities. Think of the social strain: farmers who couldn't meet their tax quotas, families in hardship, and the palace would see its main source of wealth, the agricultural tax, just evaporate. With dwindling stores, how could it feed its vast workforce? How could it supply its armies, the very enforcers of its power? This environmental stress likely sparked unrest and migration, people moving to find food and water, putting pressure on neighboring regions. The authority of the king, supposed to be divinely appointed for prosperity, would be questioned. When the central power couldn't fulfill its most basic promise, providing food, its legitimacy crumbled. The first crack wasn't an invading army, it was a dry wind. A shrinking river, a series of failed harvests that slowly starved the heart of the palace economy. But this climate shock didn't work alone. It exposed a critical vulnerability in how these kingdoms worked. A fragility woven into their very connections with each other. A starving palace was vulnerable. Its strength came from materials it couldn't find at home. These kingdoms traded for survival. The whole era was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Copper you could get from places like Cyprus, but tin was rare. It came from very far away, likely modern Afghanistan, carried over fragile networks, caravan routes, shipping lanes. That was the critical vulnerability. The palace economy worked on a just-in-time model. They didn't stockpile years of tin. They needed a constant flow. Then climate droughts hit. Overland routes through arid regions became impossible. Caravans couldn't find water. Local communities struggling themselves might turn to raiding. The highways of commerce became gauntlets, and the seas grew dangerous. The turmoil from the sea peoples made maritime trade a gamble. Ports were threatened, ships were lost. So picture a palace administrator in Greece or Anatolia. Workshops full of bronzesmiths, contracts for weapons, tools needed for the harvest. But the tin shipments from the east stop. The copper from Cyprus gets unreliable. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't equip your soldiers with the best weapons. You can't make durable tools for farmers or builders. And bronze was more than a material. It was wealth, a symbol of elite power, of divine favor. Not producing it wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a symbolic collapse. The palace's role as provider and protector was visibly crumbling. This crisis exposed a lack of redundancy. Their whole military and economic superiority was tied to one imported technology. When those long trade threads snapped, the palaces were stranded, rich in ambition but poor in the very stuff that made their world work, an economic paralysis. It left them weak in reality and in perception. But as the external world pressed in, the ground was also softening from within. The palace economy was a pyramid. And the base of that pyramid was farmers, herders, laborers. Their lives worked on a contract. You work the land, you surrender a large part of the harvest to the palace. And in return, you get protection. You get rations when times are lean. You get access to tools. It was a system built on trust, on predictability. But then the droughts came. The harvests failed, and that contract just shattered. The palace granaries, those symbols of security, they started to empty. The redistributive machine, so efficient in good times, it sputtered. It stalled. The rations promised to a potter's family, to a soldier's household, they got smaller, or they didn't arrive at all. Meanwhile, the elites in the palace, the scribes, the priests, the warriors close to the king, they'd be the last to feel the shortage. Their privileges, their access to stored wine and oil and grain that would have been protected, that disparity, it became a poison. You can almost hear the whispers. Why break our backs tilling parched fields when the grain just goes to a half-empty storehouse? Why do the chariot makers still eat well while our children go hungry? That resentment festered. It became a loss of faith. The palace wasn't a protector anymore. It was a burden, and that social fracture, it had consequences. A society facing threats needs unity. It needs farmers who will also fight. It needs craftsmen who will work to repair the walls. But when people feel the system is rigged against them, that collective will, it evaporates. Why defend a palace that doesn't feed you? In some places that might have led to rebellion. In others, it was a quiet withdrawal, people slipping away from their villages, refusing a call to arms, losing the will to maintain the irrigation systems, the terrace farming, all that required communal effort. The kingdom became hollow. Its military might depended on conscripts who had no stake in its survival. Its agricultural output relied on a demoralized population. The palace, clinging to its top-heavy control, had severed its most vital connection. The loyalty of its people, that internal decay meant that when the final blows came from raiders, from disaster, there was no deep well of social cohesion to draw from. The walls were still high, but the will to hold them had crumbled from within. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show this scene of controlled chaos. Pharaoh Ramesses III is standing there, triumphant. And you have these waves of warriors wearing horned helmets and feathered headdresses, thrown into disarray. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. And for a long time, history saw them as the main cause of the collapse. A mysterious barbarian horde sweeping in from the unknown to destroy civilization. But modern scholarship shows a much more complex picture, a more revealing one. Who were these groups? The truth is, they were likely all of the above. And that's the key to understanding their role. They weren't a single nation or a single army. They were a collection of different tribes and communities, all on the move. Some were undoubtedly raiders, pirates, seizing an opportunity in a time of growing weakness, but many were probably migrants, even refugees, displaced by the same droughts and famines that were crippling the great kingdoms. You can think of it as a domino effect of human desperation. As the palace economies in Anatolia or the Aegean faltered, the communities that depended on them were uprooted. Some took to ships with their families, looking for new land. Others, with nothing left to lose, turned to violence. They became a symptom of the wider collapse. And a powerful accelerant, their movements weren't a coordinated invasion. They were a storm of human consequence, and their impact was catastrophic for the fragile system that remained. These seaborne groups attacked the lifelines of the Bronze Age world, the coastal cities, the trade routes. A port like Ugarit, whose wealth came from the sea, was devastatingly vulnerable. Its final, panicked letters speak of enemy ships already sighted, while its own fleet was far away. The sea peoples didn't need to conquer every inland palace. They only needed to strangle the trade, burn the ports, spread terror along the coasts. This severed the connections between kingdoms, made it impossible for them to support each other. It turned a series of regional crises into a total network failure. So were they the cause? It's more accurate to see them as the embodiment of the age's chaos. A human wave set in motion by failing systems, a wave that then crashed down upon those same systems with enough force to break them for good. Their design had this deep interdependence. And that was the flaw. A palace economy could handle a local drought or one trade route failing, but it couldn't survive having all its lifelines cut at once. It's like a network of cities on one electrical grid. One power plant goes down, the others can manage. But if the whole grid is overloaded by a cascade of failures, every city goes dark together. That's what happened across the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire wasn't just a neighbor, it was a crucial supplier. When drought and famine hit its heartland, it stopped exporting grain to its allies, to its trading partners downstream. So a city that relied on that imported food found its own stores dwindling. At the same time, Cyprus' ancient Alatia was the primary source of copper. Political unrest there, or raids, didn't just hurt Cyprus. It meant smiths from Greece to Mesopotamia found their raw materials delayed or cut off entirely. Without copper, and with tin shipments from the east also in jeopardy, the whole bronze production system seized up. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was a military and cultural emergency. Bronze was the material of authority, of weapons, of ceremonial gifts, of status. Its scarcity meant kings couldn't arm new soldiers or reward loyal followers. The very symbol of their power was melting away, and then came the human dominoes. As regions became unstable, people were forced to move. Farmers whose land turned to dust, soldiers whose pay stopped coming, entire communities displaced by conflict. These groups became mobile, desperate populations. Some might become the raiders we call the Sea Peoples. Others just poured into neighboring territories, overwhelming their resources and sparking new conflicts. A rebellion in one vassal state could inspire rebellion in another. As the central authority's weakness was exposed, so the collapse of the Hittites increased the pressure on Egypt. The raids on Cyprus multiplied the strain on Levantine ports like Ugarit. Each failure sent a shockwave through the network, weakening the next node, making it more likely to fail in turn. These civilizations had built a world of remarkable efficiency, but they'd forgotten to build in any buffers. There was no backup plan. Their prosperity was a collective achievement, but their vulnerability was also shared. The connections that had allowed them to flourish, to exchange ideas and wealth, became the channels through which disaster spread. With terrifying speed, their greatest strength in the end became a single catastrophic point of failure. There was another weakness in their design. It was built into the material that defined them. These palace economies were prisoners of bronze, and bronze was a system. To make it required a fragile ballet of logistics. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, or maybe the British Isles. These two metals had to be mined, shipped across dangerous distances, and brought together by specialists. The palaces controlled all of it. It gave them their military edge, their chariots, their swords, and it was the cornerstone of their luxury trade. But this control had a cost. It created a deep inertia. Why would a king experiment with a crude metal like iron when bronze gave him weapons of proven quality and immense prestige? The whole economy was built around this one material, so they doubled down. They perfected the system they knew, making it more efficient, more centralized. They became optimized for bronze in a world that was about to change. Meanwhile, on the fringes, a different technology was taking shape. Ironworking was known, but it was difficult. Early iron was often brittle, not better than well-made bronze, but it had one advantage: its ingredients were everywhere. Iron ore is far more common than the rare tin you need for bronze. You didn't need a vast international network. A village could find it locally, and as the Great Bronze Age trade networks began to fray, this advantage shifted. It went from a curiosity to a potential lifeline, but the palaces couldn't pivot. Their workshops were set up for bronze. Their smiths were masters of bronze. Their entire military doctrine relied on the specific properties of bronze weapons and armor. To switch to iron would have meant admitting failure, retraining craftsmen, rethinking strategies, all in the middle of a crisis. It was an impossible ask for a rigid hierarchy. So when the trade networks for tin and copper collapsed, the palace armories didn't transition. They stalled. The production of new weapons slowed to a trickle. Soldiers couldn't be equipped. Broken gear couldn't be replaced. Imagine an army that suddenly can't get ammunition, but refuses to adopt anything else. That's the strategic obsolescence that hit these kingdoms. Their military power, the thing that enforced their authority, was melting down and not being recast. This gave an accidental advantage to anyone not locked into the old system. Raiders, migrants, rebels, people less concerned with prestige and more with practicality could experiment with iron. They weren't starting from scratch, they were starting from necessity. The collapse of the bronze system created the conditions for iron to rise, but for the great palaces, this was a transition they couldn't survive. They were perfected for a world of stability and long-distance exchange. When that world vanished, their specialization became a trap. They were masters of a universe that was ceasing to exist. Their technological inertia was matched by a rigid way of thinking. The administrative machine that made the palace economies possible also made them brittle. It was like a vast, intricate clockwork, every gear designed for one predictable motion, and then you get an earthquake. That was the bureaucracy in its final days. A system built for accounting, for control, for maintaining equilibrium in a stable world. It wasn't built for emergencies. There's a snapshot of this from the last hours of Ugarit. Clay tablets found in the burning ruins. One records a shipment of grain, noting the amount down to the smallest measure. Another is a desperate letter from the king. It says his troops and ships are far away and the enemy is sighted offshore. These two documents were probably written in the same building at roughly the same time. One part of the system is calmly doing its job, tallying resources. The other is screaming that the system is about to be obliterated. The bureaucracy couldn't reconcile the two. It knew how to record a crisis, but not how to stop one. That's the rigidity. The decision-making was hierarchical and slow. A local official seeing a new band of raiders or a shift in weather couldn't act. He had to send a message up the chain. That message would be copied onto a tablet, filed, wait for a scribe to bring it to a supervisor, then maybe to a council. Weeks or months could pass. By the time an order came back down, the situation on the ground had changed completely. That slowness prevented any adaptive response. Could farmers have been told to plant more drought-resistant crops? Could trade routes have been redirected overland if the sea lanes were dangerous? Could quick, local alliances have been made with neighboring towns for defense? The palace system, in its top-down glory, was incapable of that flexibility. It demanded all solutions come from the center, and the center was overwhelmed, processing information about problems that had already evolved into new, worse problems. The system was optimized for peak efficiency in peaceful times. It had no redundancy, no backup plan, no permission for local initiative. A giant, magnificent tree with deep roots but a completely rigid trunk. When the storm winds came, it couldn't bend. It could only record the increasing force of the gale, right up until the moment it snapped. The people running these systems weren't foolish. They were trapped in the logic of their own creation, following their procedures faithfully into the dark. That rigid bureaucracy was part of a larger web. A web of communication that covered the whole known world, and we have a window into it. These clay tablets, the Amarna letters, found in Egypt, they're the diplomatic letters between pharaohs and the other great kings. You read them and you see this elaborate courtesy, rulers calling each other my brother, speaking of everlasting peace, mutual love. They exchanged gifts. Gold, ivory, chariots, fine furniture, but it was more than politeness. It was a system, a carefully maintained system of alliances, a dance of reciprocity and obligation. That's what kept the peace, that's what smoothed trade. It was the social glue for that whole Bronze Age world. But then you turn up the heat. What happens to that glue? When the material foundations start to crumble, the letters from later, closer to the collapse, they tell a different story. The tone shifts, you see desperate appeals. Veiled accusations, a growing panic. One ruler writes to another, pleading for troops against invaders. describing cities burning, fields laid waste. The reply, if it comes, is an excuse. My troops are busy elsewhere, my chariots need repair, I'll send help soon, a promise that never comes, the trust just evaporates. The Brotherhood of Kings, it was a fair-weather pact. It depended on everyone being prosperous enough, stable enough, to fulfill their obligations. When drought hit and harvests failed, a king's first duty was to feed his own people. He couldn't spare grain for an ally. When bronze got scarce, he hoarded it for his own army. When raiders appeared on his shores, he recalled his ships. That diplomatic network, so robust in times of plenty, had no mechanism for mutual aid, not in a true system-wide emergency. Each ruler was forced to look inward, to prioritize survival over solidarity, and that failure had a cascading effect. Imagine a kingdom under attack, counting on those promised troops. When the troops never arrive, that kingdom falls. Its fall sends new waves of refugees, desperate soldiers, across the borders of the next kingdom, overwhelming them. The collapse of that aid doesn't just doom one city. It breaks a link in a chain of security that was holding the whole region together. The safety net was gone. What might have been contained, a localized disaster, instead became a contagion. A contagion of failure. It's a lesson in political capital. All those gifts, the flowery letters, the royal marriages, they were a vast investment in social trust. But that trust was a currency, and it was only as good as the material wealth backing it up. When the grain stores emptied and the bronze shipments stopped, that currency hyperinflated. It became worthless. A king's word was no longer binding because he no longer had the resources to make it good. The palaces were left isolated, standing alone in the gathering storm, watching the signal fires of their allies go dark one by one. The silence from a brother king was as terrifying as the sound of enemy ships on the horizon. You can still walk through those ruins. You can see the evidence. At Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, they found this thick, dark line in the earth. A layer of ash, burned debris mixed with broken pottery, shattered bricks, and it wasn't just one building, it was across the whole city, a destruction layer. A moment frozen, it tells you something catastrophic happened, and it happened fast. But what's more revealing is what comes after, or what doesn't. Above that ash, you don't find new palace foundations. No new temples. You find these simple, crude huts built right on the rubble. Squatters living in the shell of a dead empire, or in some places you find nothing. Just silence, abandonment for centuries. That pattern repeats like an echo. At Ugarit, that wealthy port, the destruction is so intense it feels deliberate. Furious at the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, like Pylos, you see the same signature: fire, collapse, and then a dramatic drop. The grand halls are never rebuilt. But the evidence isn't just in the ash, it's in the sudden silence. Before the collapse, these palaces were full of scribes. They kept records on clay tablets. Inventories of grain, shipments of copper, worker assignments. In Greece, they used linear B. In Anatolia and the Levant, it was cuneiform. These weren't for poetry. They were the operational software of the palace economy. And after the destruction layers, that software is deleted. Linear B vanishes completely. Cuneiform use shrinks to just a few centers. In places like Greece, people stop writing for generations. That's the most profound clue. It wasn't just cities damaged in a war and then rebuilt. Wars had happened before. This was different. The knowledge of how to run the state, the specialized class who kept those records, was wiped out. The system didn't reboot, it crashed. The data was lost, so when you piece it together, the widespread ash, the lack of rebuilding, the death of literacy, you're not looking at a bad century. You're looking at what they call a systems collapse. Imagine a towering, intricate mobile, beautifully balanced, then several key strings are cut at once. The pieces don't just sag, they tumble into a heap, the connections are gone. The design is unrecognizable. That's what happened. The economic system, the political hierarchy, the international network, the specialized knowledge. They all fell together. What remained were fragments. People still lived, life went on, but it was a simpler life, a quieter life, a much poorer life, built on the ashes of a forgotten complexity. The clay tablets from Pylos show a kingdom in decline. There's a record about a shortage of bronze workers. Another one sets watchers along the coast. You can sense the worry in these lists. The palace was trying to keep control, but it was watching for threats it couldn't really stop anymore. This was a society under strain. And they started turning on each other. You see more fortifications, signs of violent destruction at places like Thebes and Orchomenos, rival kingdoms probably fighting over fewer resources. That internal war was a catastrophe. It used up manpower, it diverted food, it made any kind of unified response impossible. So while the kings were fighting each other, their foundation was crumbling. A long drought, the climate data shows it, that would have killed the harvest, less grain going into the palace storerooms, fewer taxes to pay soldiers. The king's hand got weaker, and then the trade networks fell apart. The ships from the east stopped coming. The palace lost its supply of tin, couldn't make bronze, couldn't make the weapons for its elite or the tools it needed. So you have a local kingdom weakened by famine, its bronze running out, its armies tired from fighting other palaces. The social contract starts to fray. The palace can't provide security anymore, can't redistribute, and then maybe a final blow. Invaders from the sea, or bands from the hills, or an uprising from inside. However it happened, the result is the same. The palace at Pylos was burned. The great hall, the storerooms, the archives, all burned. The fire was so hot it baked those clay tablets, preserved them. A moment of administrative worry, frozen. After the fire cooled, nobody rebuilt. The knowledge of linear B script died with the scribes. Fresco painting was forgotten, monumental architecture forgotten, the population scattered, moved to smaller hilltops, they went back to subsistence living. Small plots of land, herding animals, that intricate palace economy was gone. What came after was simpler, poorer, isolated. We call it the Greek Dark Age. Not because people were ignorant, but because looking back, the light of that complex civilization went out. The Mycenaean case is about compounding failure. External pressures, drought, trade collapse were bad, but combined with internal fighting, fragmentation, that created a recipe for a complete collapse. The palace didn't bend, it broke. The Mycenaean kingdoms fell apart from the inside, but for the Hittite Empire, it was geography and strategy. This was a superpower. A rival to Egypt, but its foundations were on precarious ground. The Hittite heartland around the capital Hattusa in central Anatolia, it wasn't a land of plenty. Thin soil, unreliable rainfall. To feed its population, all the soldiers and bureaucrats, the empire became dependent, totally dependent on grain shipments from its fertile provinces to the south. Places like coastal Syria, the palace economy wasn't just centralized, it was externally fueled, and that created a critical vulnerability. So when the great droughts came in the late 13th century, they didn't just strain the system. They attacked it at multiple points. The heartland's own harvests failed, that caused immediate hardship, but the same climate crisis hit the southern breadbaskets. Those regions had their own famine. They could no longer send their surplus north. The lifeline was cut, and at the same moment, the empire's political structure began to unravel. The Hittites ruled through a network of vassal states, allied kingdoms, bound by treaties and the threat of force. These distant territories provided grain, but also metals, timber, soldiers. As drought and scarcity gripped these regions too, local loyalties evaporated. Why send your last food to a distant capital when your own people are hungry? Vassals rebelled, declared independence, or just fell to other forces. The empire's periphery, its source of strength, disintegrated, and the Hittites were in no position to reclaim it. They were locked in expensive rivalries with the new kingdom of Egypt to the south and the rising power of Assyria to the east. These commitments drained the treasury, pinned down their armies, so when the environmental and political crisis hit, the empire had no strategic reserve, no cushion. It was overextended, underfed. Isolated, the end was decisive. The great capital Hattusa, this fortified city of temples and palaces, it wasn't just conquered, it was systematically abandoned. The evidence points to a deliberate departure. The city's gates were closed from the inside, important records were buried, and then it was burned. But this wasn't the work of an enemy taking a prize. No new Hittite king returned to rebuild, no foreign empire moved in. The site was left to the elements for centuries, and that tells us something. The collapse wasn't a temporary setback. It was the total failure of an entire idea of empire. The complex administration, the religious ceremonies, the very reason for the city's existence, all of it ceased to have meaning when the system that supported it vanished. The Hittite state didn't transform, it dissolved. Its territories splintered into small neo-Hittite city-states. They remembered the old glory but could never recreate its scale. Their story is a lesson in the dangers of building an empire on resources you don't directly control, in a climate you can't predict. When the connections snapped, the center could not hold. The Hittite Empire fell from overreach, but another kingdom fell for the opposite reason. It was too connected, too specialized. It was too vital to the system that was failing. On the Syrian coast, there was Ugarit, a city of commerce, a glittering port, not a fortress, not an agricultural center. Its wealth was in its docks, its warehouses, its trade networks. It was a financial hub, the middleman for the whole Bronze Age world. Ships came from Cyprus, from Anatolia, Egypt. The Aegean, they traded copper, ivory, precious glass, that famous purple dye from sea snails. The palace ran it all, every transaction recorded on clay tablets. In a unique, simplified script, Ugarit's entire identity was interdependence, and that made it fragile. The tablets from its final years are a real-time dispatch. They show the panic, the human scale collapse. There's one letter. King Amurapi of Ugarit writes to the ruler of Alashia, probably Cyprus. His tone is desperate. He says all his troops are stationed far away, in Hittite lands. His entire fleet is on a mission. Also far to the east, he writes, "My father, enemy ships are coming. They've set fire to towns along the coast. My own forces are not here. I am defenseless. What should I do?" The reply from Alashia is a monument to failed diplomacy. No soldiers, no ships, just cold advice. It says, you must face the enemy on your own. Strengthen your walls, station your chariots and troops, and wait. The advice is meaningless. The letter acknowledges the truth. Ugarit has no troops left. The system called its defenses away, and the system would not send them back. Another tablet, Amurapi pleads with the king of Carchemish, a Hittite viceroy, asking for help. The response, if there was one, never arrived. These letters show a terrifying reality. Ugarit's security was outsourced. Its safety depended on the stability of its allies, its overlords. But in those final decades, every kingdom was facing the same fires. No one had reserves to spare. The network that created its wealth became a trap. When the drought hit, it disrupted the hinterland that fed the city. When trade routes faltered, the docks fell silent, and when the sea peoples moved along the coast, they found a prize, rich, vital, and utterly exposed. Archaeology shows a city sacked and burned, so completely it was never rebuilt. Its specialized knowledge, its unique script, its role as a gateway, all of it vanished. Ugarit's story is the purest example of a single point of failure. It optimized for peak efficiency in a connected world, but it had no plan B, no fallback agriculture, No isolated redoubt, no self-sufficient economy. Its prosperity was a mirror, reflecting the health of the entire network, and when the network shattered, the reflection disappeared. The ground was shaking. Deep under the eastern Mediterranean, the plates were shifting. A series of major earthquakes hit the region. They hit at a terrible time. These were societies built on stone, massive walls, granaries full of food, harbors and water systems. An earthquake doesn't just damage things, it destroys the symbols of power. A granary collapses and a year's food is gone. A defensive tower falls and the city is open. A harbor silts up and trade stops. For people already facing drought and famine, this felt like the end. It was a spiritual crisis. Kings claimed divine favor. A shattered temple was a message. The gods had withdrawn. The social order saw it as a verdict. The elite had failed. They failed to keep harmony with the heavens. You see it in the archaeology. At Mycenae, at Turin, they were rebuilding thicker walls. Repaired foundations, a society trying to patch itself back together, but every repair uses resources. It drains labor and morale. A kingdom can survive one quake. But repeated shocks on top of everything else, that erodes resilience. It breaks it. The quakes had a strategic impact too. Think of Ugarit waiting for enemy ships. If its walls were already cracked from a tremor, those desperate letters make sense. The physical defenses were crumbling, or Hattusa, the Hittite capital. A fortress on a plateau, seismic activity could disrupt the water supply. A cracked aqueduct, a collapsed cistern that could doom a city. So many historians see these disasters not as the cause but the trigger. The knockout punch. A society already struggling with food shortages and trade collapse has no slack, no surplus. An earthquake turns a crisis into a catastrophe. It adds immediate physical chaos to the slow grind of economic failure, so the picture gets more complex. It's a cascade. Climate change strained the farms. Broken trade caused paralysis, social inequality bred weakness, and then the earth itself rebelled. It delivered a physical blow. It shattered the last illusion of control. For a palace bureaucracy used to managing everything, this was unmanageable. A force no clay tablet could command. The silence after the collapse wasn't just quiet. It was an absence of memory. The palaces fell, and they took something with them, something invisible, the knowledge of how to run a civilization. Think of a master architect. The only person who knew the exact ratio of materials to build a vaulted ceiling that could last centuries, or the chief scribe, fluent in the complex diplomatic language used to negotiate between empires. These weren't just skilled people, they were living libraries, and when the walls burned, those libraries closed forever. This was a loss on a scale that's hard to grasp. The intricate palace accounting, recorded on clay tablets in scripts like Linear B and cuneiform, it just stopped. No one was left to read them, no one to teach the next generation. The art of crafting true bronze, an alloy needing specific proportions of tin and copper from distant lands, that faded as the trade routes vanished. Even the knowledge of how to organize thousands of laborers to build a monumental gateway or a fortified wall, forgotten. Societies that had coordinated across continents reverted to local, oral traditions. The blueprint for complexity itself had been misplaced. The result was a profound reset. In Greece, the archaeological record shows a stark transition. The grand tholos tombs of the Mycenaean kings were replaced by simple burials. Pottery styles became less refined, more local. The very concept of a centralized state with a bureaucracy and tax collection. That disappeared for hundreds of years. This wasn't a step back. It was a leap into an unfamiliar simplicity. Communities had to relearn from a much more basic starting point how to govern. How to build, how to record their own stories. The so-called Dark Ages were dark not because of evil, but because the lights of specialized knowledge had been blown out. It teaches a crucial lesson, a slightly unsettling one, about civilization. Advanced knowledge isn't a permanent possession, it's a fragile ecosystem. It requires stability, institutions, a chain of teachers and students to sustain it. The palace system was that ecosystem for the late Bronze Age. When it shattered, the knowledge it nurtured couldn't survive in the wild. The recovery took centuries, not because people were less intelligent, but because they had to rebuild the foundational structures of society before they could even begin to reclaim the heights their ancestors had reached. It's a reminder, progress isn't a straight line. It's a story that can be interrupted, with entire chapters lost to time. History is rarely a simple story with one clear villain. The collapse has sparked decades of debate. Scholars have proposed other explanations. They challenge the main story or they add to it. One line of thought looks inward at the palace economy itself. Could it have broken under its own weight? Some point to a systemic debt crisis. In that system, the palace would loan seed grain or livestock to farmers. A series of poor harvests from drought maybe could have made those debts impossible to repay, and that would happen on a massive scale. It creates a class of desperate people. It undermines the social order the palace was built on. It's a familiar scenario. Financial systems can be fragile. Another theory focuses on social unrest. That inequality we talked about, it wasn't just background, it could have been the spark. Think of a farmer. His family has worked the land for generations. The rains fail, the harvest is meager, and the palace tax collectors still arrive. They demand their share for the storerooms. Resentment simmers, then it boils over. Could a popular uprising have toppled these states from within? The archaeological record is often silent on that. Revolutions don't leave inscriptions boasting of success. But the idea is there. The greatest threat might not come from outside the walls. It might come from the people inside who have simply had enough. Then there are the forces of nature. Beyond even drought, some geologists and historians talk about a possible volcanic eruption, a major event like Hekla in Iceland around that time. It could have spewed ash into the atmosphere. That leads to cooler temperatures, failed growing seasons across the northern hemisphere. This volcanic winter adds another global shock. A layer of planetary bad luck, civilizations far apart all suffering the same climatic punch, delivered from the Earth itself. Engaging with these debates isn't about choosing a winner. It's about the complexity of the past. There's likely no single smoking gun. Instead, picture a room. It's filled with stressors. Drought stands in one corner. Trade disruption in another. Social inequality leans against the wall. An earthquake or volcano might be waiting at the door. For a healthy society, dealing with one might be manageable. But when the door swings open and they all rush in at once, the system is overwhelmed. The weight of each factor varied from place to place. In the Hittite heartland, drought may have been the heaviest blow. For Ugarit, the trading city, the severing of maritime links was catastrophic. This multi-causal mosaic is what makes the collapse a puzzle. It reminds us that history is a conversation. New evidence can always reshape the story. Life still came up from the ruins. The palaces were gone, but people adapted. And in that adaptation, a new age was forged. It wasn't a return to the old ways, it was a complete reboot. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, but that shift in technology tells a deeper story. Iron didn't win because it was better. Early iron was often worse, more brittle. Its victory was about necessity, about accessibility. Iron ore is common. You can find it in hillsides almost anywhere. Not like the rare tin you needed for bronze. When those long trade routes snapped, communities couldn't rely on distant kings for their metal. So they turned to what was local. They learned to work the iron from their own ground, and that decentralized power. A village blacksmith could now make tools and weapons. He didn't need permission from a palace. The elite monopoly was broken at the forge. That decentralization echoed everywhere. the big, top-down kingdoms fragmented. Smaller units took their place. On the coast of what's now Lebanon, you got the Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon. They weren't vast farm empires, they were networked maritime traders. Their prosperity was cedar wood, purple dye, long voyages. Up in the highlands of Canaan, loose confederations of tribes formed, the early Israelites. Communities based on shared kinship and faith, a stark contrast to the god-kings of Egypt. Power wasn't in one awe-inspiring palace anymore, it was distributed. Contested, often local, this world after the collapse was poorer for a long time. The magnificent art, the grand architecture, the luxury goods, those faded. Literacy, that mark of the bureaucratic state, became rare, but that simplicity created a blank slate. Without the shadow of a pharaoh or a great king, new experiments became possible. People had to reorganize from the ground up. The old hierarchies were leveled. That painful clearing made space. Centuries later, you see the fruits. In Greece, scattered villages coalesced into the polis, the independent city-state, where concepts of citizenship and debate took root. In the Near East, new models of empire rose. The Assyrians, later the Persians, these weren't copies of the old palace economies. They were more sophisticated, better at integrating diverse peoples. Building roads that connected rather than just extracted. The collapse was a catastrophe for those who lived through it, but it was also a brutal pruning. It proved the end of one world is always the start of another, in ways the fallen kings could never have imagined. That decentralized world they built, it feels familiar now. Because we're living in the mirror image of their peak. Our age is defined by that same dense web of connections. The palace kings would have envied it. A modern smartphone contains materials mined from dozens of countries across multiple continents. Its assembly relies on a logistical ballet. Ships, planes, trucks all have to stay in rhythm. Our food, our energy, our medicines, they travel through supply chains of breathtaking complexity. This is our palace economy, but on a planetary scale. And like them, we've optimized this system for efficiency. The modern principle is just-in-time delivery. Warehouses don't stockpile goods. Products arrive precisely when needed. It minimizes cost and it works perfectly in a stable world, but it leaves almost no room for error. We felt this fragility not long ago. When a global health crisis emerged, it wasn't just a medical challenge. It was a shock to that entire system. Ports clogged, semiconductor chips, the tiny brains of everything from cars to refrigerators became scarce. The flows stuttered. And the world felt for a moment how delicate our abundance really is. That was a tremor. The Bronze Age kingdoms faced the earthquake. Their equivalent of a semiconductor chip was tin. When those trade routes faltered, their entire technological base was threatened. For us, a disruption in rare earth minerals or a closure of critical shipping lanes could have a similar cascading effect. The lesson isn't that trade is bad. The palace economies flourished because of it. The lesson is about single points of failure. When everything depends on one narrow route or one source or one way of doing things, the entire structure is vulnerable. We see this in other ways too. Their climate stress came from prolonged drought. Ours unfolds as shifting weather patterns, rising seas, intensifying storms. These aren't distant threats. They're already reshaping agriculture, displacing communities, straining resources. The palace scribes recorded dwindling grain harvests. Our satellites measure retreating glaciers and parched reservoirs. The data is different, but the underlying challenge to a society's foundation is the same. And then there's the internal strain, the inequality. The glittering centers of Mycenae and Hattusa cast long shadows over the farmers who supported them. Today, the distance between the boardroom and the factory floor, while connected digitally, can represent a similar chasm in experience and security. When a system is perceived as rigged for the few, social cohesion frays. Trust in institutions erodes. and a society facing external pressure finds it harder to pull together. This is the sobering reflection in that ancient mirror. Their collapse shows us that systemic risk isn't science fiction. It's a historical reality. It happens when multiple stressors converge: environmental, economic, social. They converge on a system that has lost its flexibility. The palaces were rigid. Their responses were slow, bureaucratic, anchored in the old way of doing things. Our advantage is that we can see this pattern. We have their story, so studying their end isn't about predicting doom. It's a masterclass in resilience. It asks us urgent questions. Where are our single points of failure? How do we build in buffers, in redundancy? Can we design systems that are both efficient and robust? The answer might mean valuing security over some marginal cost savings. It might mean diversifying supply lines, investing in sustainable local capacity, fostering a greater degree of social solidarity. It means recognizing that interdependence is a source of great strength, but only if the bonds are strong enough to withstand a shock. The kings in their palaces never saw the cascade coming. We have no such excuse. Their ruins are a monument, not just to what was lost, but to a principle we must now remember. Civilizations thrive not when everything works perfectly, but when they can adapt when things go wrong. We get to the quiet parts of the map, the blank spots where the evidence just stops. We've put a lot together, but the late Bronze Age collapse is still a silhouette. We can see the outline clearly, but the inside is shadow. There's the Sea Peoples, that famous trigger. Egyptian carvings show them fighting with their helmets and their ships, but the words are just labels. They aren't life stories. Were they an alliance with one goal? Or were they just many different groups, displaced and desperate, all moving in the same chaotic flow? Did they come from the Aegean, from Anatolia, from southern Europe? We have good guesses, but no proof. Their reasons are just as hard to see. Were they invaders looking for loot? Or were they refugees themselves, pushed out by the same droughts and famines that were breaking the palaces? They might not have been a cause at all. Maybe they were just the clearest sign of a world already falling apart. Then the timeline, it has soft edges. We know the century of the crisis, but the exact order of the falls is like watching dominoes from far away. Did the Hittite capital fall before Ugarit sent its last panicked message? Or after? Did rebellion empty a palace first, letting raiders just walk in? Or was it the other way around? In some places, the destruction layer in the ground is obvious, but the specific year, the season, even who did it, that's lost. That fuzziness matters. It changes the story from one big catastrophe to a rolling, uneven wave of failure. One kingdom's collapse might have given another a few more years, a precarious life. Which leads to maybe the biggest mystery. What did it feel like to live through it? The clay tablets have administrative details, grain shortages, missing workers, defense plans. That's the view from the palace, but what about the farmer watching his fields fail for a third year? The merchant whose normal ports only had rumors of pirates? The family packing what they could carry, joining a slow migration away from a dying city? Their experience, the daily worry, the fading hope, the grim adjustments, that's almost silent to us. We see the roof of history collapsed, but the conversations underneath it we struggle to hear. And you wonder, did the rulers see it coming? Were their advisors pointing to the shrinking grain, the restless frontiers, the changing weather, only to be ignored by elites who are too comfortable, too certain? Or was the decline so slow, so hidden by the system's own momentum, that they only really saw it when the enemy was at the gates? The last tablet from Ugarit is a stark message. It says the city's ships and troops are away and the enemy has been sighted. It feels like a moment of shocking, belated awareness. These gaps aren't a failure of research. They're just what happens when you study the deep past. History is a puzzle. Most of the pieces are gone forever. A lot of the ones we have are damaged. That forces a kind of humility. It reminds us our explanations are just models. They're the best stories we can tell with the fragments we've found, and that's what makes the search pull you in. A single new shipwreck found in the Mediterranean, a new analysis of ancient pollen in a lake bed, a translated piece of a letter nobody knew existed. Any one of those could shift the picture. The collapse isn't a closed case, it's an open question, a reminder that the past is never fully finished, and our understanding of it is always one discovery away from changing. Those mysteries teach us something. Even powerful systems can be fragile, not because they were weak, but because they were built for a world that vanished. So what did they lack? What makes a society resilient? First, they had no diversification. Their whole economy was like one tower on a single foundation. That foundation was grain and the bronze trade. Drought hit the grain, turmoil hit the trade, and the whole structure shook. A resilient society needs multiple pillars. Different crops for different conditions, alternative materials, a wider trade network. So if one connection fails, others hold. The palaces were specialists. Incredibly efficient at one thing, but when that one thing faltered, there was no backup plan. Second, they were rigid, not agile. Their bureaucracy was a machine for maintaining the status quo. It recorded, it allocated, it controlled, but it couldn't innovate, it couldn't pivot. It's like a ship captain so fixed on his charted course, he won't turn the wheel even with a storm ahead. When the droughts came, a flexible system might have shifted crops, changed irrigation, formed new local alliances. The palace system was too slow, too hierarchical. Built for predictability, and when the world became unpredictable, it broke. Third, and this is crucial, they lost social cohesion. The glittering wealth of the elite stood against the hard life of the farmer. That inequality was tolerated in good times when the palace provided security and distribution. But when harvests failed and the granaries emptied, that social contract shattered. Resentment became unrest. A resilient society invests in fairness. It makes sure that when hardship comes, people feel they're in it together, that the burden is shared. That creates a willingness to cooperate, to sacrifice, to defend the community. The palaces lost that loyalty. When external threats came, they were defending walls that many inside had no stake in protecting. Finally, they weren't investing for the long term. They were extracting maximum yield from the land and their trade networks to fuel their monuments and armies. There's little sign they were building soil health, managing forests, creating water reserves. They were mining their own foundation for short-term gain. Resilience means thinking in generations, not just harvest cycles. It means sometimes taking a smaller yield this year so the land can still produce a century from now. The lesson is about a trade-off. The palace economies were optimized. They were sleek, powerful machines for peak performance in a stable world, but optimization has a cost. It strips away redundancy, it streamlines away alternatives, it creates a beautiful, efficient, and very fragile vase. Resilience can look a bit messy. It has backup systems, loose connections, spare capacity. It might not be the fastest or richest system in good times, but it can bend, it can adapt. It can absorb a shock without shattering. The Bronze Age palaces chose optimization, and when the world changed, they didn't have the robustness to survive it. Their story is an ancient warning about the price of perfect efficiency and the hidden strength in preparation, in flexibility, in shared purpose. We think of collapse as an ending, a final silence, but for the people living through it, the end of the Bronze Age was more complex. For the kings, the priests, the scribes, it was a total catastrophe. Their world of palaces and international letters vanished. It never came back in that form, but then you step outside the palace walls, the story changes. For a farmer in the hills, a potter in a village, a herder moving with seasons, this wasn't an apocalypse. It was a harsh transformation, difficult, often violent. The heavy hand of the palace was gone, that hand that demanded your grain, your labor as tax, the control that said where you worked, what you made, that lifted. But it was a double-edged sword, because the protection the palace gave, the distribution of goods that disappeared too, communities were on their own. Life didn't stop, it adapted. People moved to hills that were easier to defend. They shifted to herding, animals that could travel for pasture. They went back to simpler pottery, local styles. What they call the Dark Age after, it wasn't a universal emptiness. It was a time of decentralization, small, tight-knit communities, operating on a more human scale. Free from those monumental burdens of the past, this reframing matters. It challenges the idea that history only moves forward through grand, centralized empires. Sometimes progress comes from simplification, from the leveling of old hierarchies that had become oppressive. The collapse created a blank slate, a rough clearing. And in that space, without the overwhelming shadow of the palace, new social experiments could take root, slowly, different ways to organize leadership. To share resources, to define community, these began to emerge from the grassroots. This painful restructuring, it made room for the diverse city-states that came later. For the new alphabets, for the different spiritual ideas of the Iron Age. The collapse wasn't just a death, it was a difficult rebirth, a necessary one. That final lesson from the ashes might be the most important one. The way the Bronze Age palace economies all failed at once. It's a testament to the vulnerabilities built into complex civilizations. We saw a perfect storm, a climate that changed and parched the fields, critical trade routes that snapped, societies straining under their own inequality. And the movement of peoples, which was both a symptom and an accelerant of the whole thing coming apart. This wasn't a random accident, it was a systemic failure. A model that had grown too rigid, too centralized, too interdependent to survive multiple shocks arriving together. Their strength became their shared vulnerability. And when we look at our own world with its global networks and intricate supply chains, their story echoes. It has a sobering clarity. It reminds us that complexity and interconnection aren't just pathways to prosperity. They're also vectors for risk, so building a civilization or a company or a community requires more than aiming for peak efficiency. It demands a conscious investment in resilience, in redundancy, in the ability to adapt when the unexpected arrives, and the unexpected is always inevitable. Their collapse isn't a prophecy of doom for us. It's a 3,000-year-old case study, a case study in systemic fragility.